Lisa Tennell and Jeremy Tennell. Streaming to you recorded from Seattle, Washington. Here we go. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Plowline Podcast. And today I am joined by an esteemed Plowline Podcast guest who has joined us on several occasions before with both this podcast and Jerry's podcast, The Evolution of Aloha. We've got Fleur Larsen with us today, and consultant extraordinaire. You may have heard of her. And if you hadn't, well, today is a great day in order to be introduced to her. Fleur and I are going to be diving into a subject that I think will be a really interesting conversation. We're going to be talking about white gender dynamics in the workplace. And without further ado, let's dive in. Fleur, you want to introduce us to that idea?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here. This came up when we were talking about a client, and it's something that's been swirling around that I see all of the time and people experience all the time, where many white-led organizations or nonprofits or companies, often there are some dynamics, hierarchy, racism, sexism, internalized sexism, in particular among white leaders and white male leaders, and then other women staff, white staff. And often, if it's a white male leader and there's like a white woman who's in HR or under him in terms of positionality and positions, what happens between their relationship can often be stuff that gets in the way of being able to advance or center racial justice.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Give me some examples that you observed.
I think the role, I don't have hard data on this. I have empirical evidence and what I see other people doing. So many white women are in the role of around HR. And I think there's a historical narrative to this around roles women were allowed to have. So there's historical sexism here and elitism, and the economics of that. And then also, HR being a place of enforcer, right? So white women kind of doing the white male leader's bidding and his enforcing of things, and HR being historically serving and protecting the company versus the actual staff.
Yes.
So, not to pigeonhole it to just that role, because it isn't only there, but that one I think serves as this blueprint to look at the way sexism is playing out, and how economics and access to like higher level roles. Sometimes, the HR is not in the C-suite, right? So there's all these kind of gatekeeping things to navigate. And so what I've seen is where white women will kind of acquiesce or go along with the way white supremacy is playing out, or in kind of take the sexism in order to maintain their white privilege, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Not to use like all the buzzwords in one sentence, but that's exactly kind of the dynamic that's happening.
Yeah. So let's do two things. One, let's hold on to this exploration of human resources for a little bit, because I think you're right. I think that's a really great dynamic within the corporate hierarchy that where we do see this. And you pointed out some very fascinating things that I want to touch on. And then let's just briefly we'll go through a joint sussing out and definition of those buzzwords. So I think you nail it when you talk about this idea that oftentimes HR is not even within the C-suite. This is also what we find in the past few years as organizations have been hiring into either social justice positions, or they've been hiring equity director positions. Neither of those are often in cabinet or C-suite positions.
Mhm.
And I think there's a control dynamic there. Many of the people who are in those positions have a tendency to be women, and not even women of color. The vast majority of equity directors and social justice directors in organizations in the country are white. And then I think there's this other historical dynamic that I'm going to speak to, because I've read on it quite a bit, but I am not going to quote sources here. So you and I are going to have kind of an empirical informed conversation.
Mhm.
Um, the history of human resources kind of comes from this dynamic of wanting to, of having a part in the organization that handles certain administrative functions that are that need to be, everything from payroll to, to behavior to even some learning and development can sometimes be placed under an HR role.
Mhm.
But there is also this impression, and I think that's probably the right word, and I think it was probably an early impression, and probably the reason why women were brought into to that position more than men, of that an employee first, employee based position, and so there's a nurturing component to it, or at least the idea of a nurturing component. But when it really plays out, especially in the past 25 years, 30 years of corporate culture, there is no nurturing involved in there. The HR department is there in order to ensure compliance to policy and procedure of the organization. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts with that?
Yeah, and just adding in the emotional labor that position often has to do around conflicts, around hiring and firing, exit interviews, all of that. And I also want to add in gatekeeping, right? Like they
Mm,
hold a lot of information and gatekeep information or access or hiring or, et cetera. And white women in general are in a gatekeeping role, even not if you're in HR, but then you double that up. And so I think it's like not a coincidence that a lot of white women are,
sure.
are in HR because our kind of set up for, in terms of the last 100 years around what white women have been allowed to do, especially wealthier white women, around having jobs or not being able to vote. Like I'm talking about like that kind of history, bringing that in of like, what's our purpose? And then there's
Yeah.
this gatekeeping kind of piece here. And then it's been operationalized in the job of HR to literally gatekeep, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so well said. And so now let's transition to those definitions, because I think what you do there, what you just did, kind of segues us nicely. So there is this natural role within white supremacy culture, and the female dynamic of gatekeeping, and being the holder of access,
Mm-hmm.
and I think so. When we're talking about white supremacy culture, this is one of the things that I think is important to define, but it's not a simple definition. What we're talking about is we're talking about a cultural, structural, systemic dynamic. We're not talking about people in white hoods. We're not talking about people with torches and signs. We're not talking about it from an individual perspective. We're talking about it from a systems perspective. And where that comes from is it comes from the fact that from the moment of the Virginia colony all the way forward, laws were put into place that literally used the word white, and actually upheld in the Supreme Court on two different occasions in the 20th century, that gatekept access to the privileges that people of European descent had within this country, which included land ownership, participation in politics, participation in the social order, and it wasn't until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that those laws were made irrelevant. Would you like to add to those definitions and those buzzwords?
I mean, no, I mean, that's just a great little mini history, and so then roll all that up and okay, what do we got going on now?
Yeah.
We're all we've inherited this history. We have our personal relationship to it. People have their understanding of it. And so there's this like deep, long, entrenched, ingrained in the water, in the air, hard to see, hard to pinpoint, except for when you're on the receiving end, it's quite clear, right?
Yes.
And so then, that's what we have that we're contending with. And then in the workplace, when there's hierarchy, and then we have, I want to be also, so I'm talking about also sexism and patriarchy and the
Yes.
way that is operating, and then you add that in like a double whammy, like a double wave, like or together, because white women on the receiving end of sexism, but the perpetrating end of white privilege, right? And so there's this interesting both and a navigation and kind of a dance around, am I like taking some sexism right now? Am I benefiting from some white privilege right now? And yes, both are all
Yeah.
happening like at the same time.
Simultaneously. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I'll give one more definition: the difference between class and caste system. And so, a class system is a system in which you can be born into for sure, and but there's mobility within that class system. You can move up it and you can move down it. A
Mm-hmm.
caste system is a system in which there is no more. You're born into it, but there is no upward or downward mobility. You're permanently stuck within that caste system based off of whatever it is that is putting you in that caste system. And I would say that we probably have two caste systems in Western civilization. The first being race, so a caste system based off of phenotypical features, and and not ethnicity, not genetics, right? It's really about the way you look and the way you present.
Yeah.
And the second being gender, men and women. And because a woman can't move up and down that caste system, and a man can't move up and down that caste system. And so we have the dual caste system in place.
Mm-hmm.
And those three dynamics have got to play, depending on where you're sitting within the class and caste systems.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to play just some crazy tricks on you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And so to pull this out of, in case you're like, well, but that's not what's happening in our organization. We don't have many nonprofits don't even have HR, right?
Yeah.
Or specifically nonprofits, it's many white women aren't in key positions of leadership. So I think either way, there's hierarchy just really really makes it glaringly obvious. The way that white women and white men need to like actually work on their stuff around sexism and white privilege.
Mm.
Doing that would make would remove some barriers to actually being able to center racial justice, because that's the stuff that ends up getting in the way. Not the only thing, but a big one that's a pattern enough, right? It's systemic. There's enough people replicating the same dynamic and same relationship, and the same hierarchy structure, that it's actually really pervasive. And it would mean, I've in a lot of my workshops, the core one I do, power with, not power over, accountability and action for white women, it starts off actually looking at sexism. And some of them are like, why are we doing this? I'm here to learn about anti-racism. Yes, we are. And I've found that holding anti-racism work as like an idea in an intellectual place is so limiting, because then I'm not like truly connected to it. It's an idea. And I believe in DEI work. I believe in anti-racism. I want good things for my colleagues of color. It's like this arm's length idea. And when we look at systemic oppression and liberation from like, where am I in this picture, in this equation? White women looking at how we've experienced sexism. And so that's what I lead them down. It's like, what's been your experience around sexism and patriarchy? And, people have different relationships to feminism, and, we address white feminism and how that's problematic and how that needs to look different. And really looking at this question, leading them down this journey of like, so what would your requests of the men in your life, or just patriarchy in general, what requests for allyship might you make?
Interesting question.
And some people have like an answer right off the bat. Some people are like,
Sure.
I don't even know. I don't even know what that would sound like or think like. And as people start to come up with some examples, listen, do your own work, apologize, right? Support our efforts, or, support women in leadership, da, 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 da. It can be emotional, like, whoa, I've never voiced that. It's vulnerable. Like, and then I asked, what would you have to face to actually, this isn't, move this out of an exercise and actually do this for real?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd face, being met with defensiveness, or what if it doesn't work? Or what if, it's so vulnerable, it's so risky.
Yes.
And then the question is, or a statement. So usually someone will say, these all sound like things our colleagues of color have asked of us.
Interesting.
And they
They come full circle.
absolutely are. I've done this workshop, like, so many times, hundreds of white women have shared almost verbatim. People come up with stuff that is exactly what's been asked of us. So then there's this pivotal moment of, oh, the thing I want, right, to receive around allyship, can I also give it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's you in that statement that you just gave, that explanation that you just gave, there's this moment where it pivots, right? You're pointing out these intellectual, existential large ideas, system ideas within our civil, within our culture, and and we can keep it out here. But when you move to the solutions, every one of those solutions was individual,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether it's men, women, whoever, right? It's individual.
Mm-hmm.
So, you and you and I have talked about this before. You and I, and Jerry, Dr. G, do all kinds of workshops,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about these large ideas. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get back to the individual small action.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the real work in this effort? Where does it really happen? Where have you experienced that with a client?
Mm-hmm. Um, well, specifically when white women have a conversation with a white man, hey, I want to talk to you about the way sexism is impacting our relationship.
Yeah, yeah,
In the same way that I have been gifted that kind of conversation from my colleagues of color. Hey, Fleur, we want to talk to you about how racism is impacting our relationship.
yes, yeah,
Right. So when white women do that emotional labor and risk taking and vulnerability and face rejection and all the humiliation, all the stuff, and then if it's received, right? Like if the white man's like, oh, thank you for coming to me, I would love to hear.
yeah,
Right. um, and that's when like some stuff opens up, because no one's doing that. And those dynamics are it's like, it's almost like you can feel them in the air, and they are blocking racial justice from happening. I've said that a few times. So what I mean by that is, um, you know, either like the women or folks really literally won't spend money on things because they want to protect the interests of whoever the male leader is or whatever. Like there can be coddling, there can be like all the martyring, there can be mothering, like all this like micromanaging, all this stuff that can happen because of socialization. Again, this is not an individual blame. This is big picture
yes,
socialization, right? And people have their own unique individual experience holding intersectionality. This is not the same across class, right? Like people have really different experiences of class, really. And even geographically, this looks really different. You know, we're both here in the Pacific Northwest. And so there's a particular flavor of this here, of
hmm
niceness, of white women's niceness that is coddling, but go away over here and I'm going to vent to my other colleagues about how hard this dynamic is around sexism, but I'm not going to address it. And again, not about blame, but that makes it stuck, right? Then it becomes gossip, then it becomes I stay victim. So
right,
so it's hard. It's hard to move out of being victimized, right? And to be in, I'm not suggesting people need to like put themselves in a bad situation and it's risky. It is risky. It is
It
risky.
is risky. It is risky because I think, and I not only speak from my own experience, but my observation in doing this work, that men have a tendency to respond to both of those questions. Like,
Yeah.
hey, can we talk about racial injustice, or hey, can we talk about patriarchy? Um, in very similar ways,
Yes.
which is to kind of pull in,
Yeah.
right? I had a conversation with Dan Molly last year on a podcast called Wholehearted Masculinity, and
Mhm.
Dan spent a lot of time talking about opening up,
Yeah.
and that's something that men have to practice. It takes
Mhm.
practice,
Mhm.
you know. And I know from experience that leaning into those conversations, as uncomfortable as they are, produces fruit.
Mhm.
Whereas closing up and reserving yourself from those conversations really, really cuts off relationship and creates can create a real festering within an organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I want men to heal and get free of this stuff. It's ruining their lives. It's ruining everybody else's lives.
Yes.
So if
Yeah.
we went like biggest bang for our buck, if for white men to do some healing work as a way to be accountable for impact of privilege and harm, that would really get to the core of things quickly.
Yes. Yes, it would.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I find, and again, I'm speaking from my own experience and observation, is I especially early on in this work, one of the things that, and in fact, you on several occasions have said, hey, reach out to this person. Hey, think about, go take a seminar from this person. And they're all men. This is so crazy that this was an idea in my head. You're suggesting all these men to go and chat with and talk with. My first instinct was that's got to be some weak, wishy-washy man stuff there. And
Mhm.
my experience is it's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite. And that response within me was so much about my own fear of that of being vulnerable. Um, and I mean, yeah, I think there is this fear of vulnerability is going to take away my masculinity.
Sure. Well, I mean, you many men were beat up if you did. Like it's a real fear. It's understandable. It's like not without reason that is there, right? And that's where like thinking about how oppression, how white supremacy, how patriarchy is harmful to men, right? Like you were literally harmed into becoming an oppressor,
Right.
right? Harm was done to you to get you, to collude with and go along with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do bring my like early childhood educator, that was my previous work in my early 20s. And so, of course, thinking about any like young, precious little kids who are like, 2, 3, 4, it's like just we did whatever our adults around us told us to do. And if that was to buck up, that was to quit your crying, if it was to, whatever, all those messages, and we did it for survival and love. So it's absolutely understandable that we hardened the way that we
Yeah.
all did. And it falls along systemic oppression lines and all that stuff. And so, I really do. I mean, I think about this in general with white folks, but anyone who is of privilege, healing from the impacts of getting socialized with privilege, which sounds kind of funny to say, right? Because you're like, what do they need to heal from? They have privilege. They're great. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, they are actually, you're absolutely surviving, but the harm that was done to get you to be an oppressor, that needs to be healed.
Totally. 100%. I think this is one of the dynamics that It is so important for white men and women to do their work around racial injustice and racial equity, and in doing that work and maturing in that work, they need to begin to help others do that work,
Mhm.
because it is that notion that Dr. G and I talk about, the colonized become the colonizers.
Yeah.
And that's not just in broad strokes, right? That's not just in like, well, this area was colonized, and the once indigenous people eventually end up, becoming a part of the colonized mind. It's also in exactly what you're talking about, that early childhood development. The indoctrination of our culture is
Yeah.
an ongoing element of colonization in order to move us into ways of being that are not about interconnection and community, but about separation
Mhm.
and dominion in
Yeah.
many respects, on continuing the legacy of dominion.
Right. 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 Yeah. And so just to bring this back to like a specifically like in the workplace, I found that when I and other white women kind of face head on, whether it's literally what requests or would you make of the men, or systemic patriarchal, the medical system, right? Like why are so many women dying in
Mm,
childbirth in the US? Like it's just,
yes.
it's in, it's insane. It's outrageous, right? Like, why don't we have paid childcare? Da, da, da. When I face that or go for that and have the conversation or make the request, I go through a process of feeling all those feelings, seeing what it's like, and am usually, that's the hope, right? Better able to then receive that when I am given feedback, or
Yes.
a request is made of me. So then I actually show up in more authentic and reliable allyship to my colleagues of color, because I get it viscerally, not just theoretically or intellectually. Right.
Yes.
I just went and did that, and damn, that was really hard. And now you're coming to me, and I want to honor that with actually showing up with integrity. Right. So there's this more of an experiential piece to get it in our body, like feel it. And usually when I do that, the exercise I mentioned, people have feelings, people cry, because
Yeah.
you're at your edge in terms of like, whoa, the gravity of what would that be like to truly lean into and risk having this conversation. Will it be received? And if we don't do that risk taking, then we usually keep holding ourselves small there.
Hmm.
And again, an analog, or not again analogous to this, supports like our colleagues of color, our loved ones of color need us to be big and powerful and bold, and not hold ourselves small as white accomplices, right? So all of this is kind of supporting and in service to racial justice explicitly.
So, am I hearing you correctly that when you're engaging in racial justice with your colleagues of color, and you're receiving this feedback, and that it in turn informs these conversations that you would have with your male colleagues, perhaps about patriarchy?
Yeah, I think it can kind of go both ways, or let's see, both directions in terms of informing, influencing, supporting, strengthening, right? And
Mm,
yeah, and kind of I don't know what the right word is for this, but when it's like, oh, like when someone gives me something, can I give that as well? Kind of
yes,
like calling me to the mat, right? Like, all right, Fleur, where's the rubber meet the road? I mean, to me, that's integrity,
totally.
right? Like, oh, wow, someone just gave me this huge gift of gently telling me how I majorly effed up.
Yeah.
Can I, what would it be like to actually just to do that risk taking and do that same thing? I can think of a couple dear white guy friends, and I felt all these feelings, right? Like, and they quote unquote get it. They've got analysis, and they had their feelings too. And they
Yeah.
responded with some defensiveness and closeness and da, 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 right? We're human. But yeah, so that I do feel like it supports both directions of looking at that.
I think maybe that's one of the reasons why my observation and experience in this work is that when these conversations come up and men are in the audience, like in workshops or something like that, many men will pull back
Yeah.
and just kind of because they're not experiencing that dynamic, right? Because
Mm,
they're and that's when we're talking about white male cisgender heterosexual men are at the top of the of the hierarchy. We're not saying that they're at the top of the heap. What we're
mhm.
saying is that oftentimes that identity, especially in the way that it carries itself in the world, um, um, doesn't have to experience the it doesn't have to experience that feedback from both directions.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
It's coming from one direction, whether it's racial equity or
mhm,
it's a conversation about patriarchy,
mhm.
and so that very much puts them in a position in which they can just sit back on their heels and just
Yeah,
kind of wait for the conversation to move past. But as you said, that's not integrity.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes they think being respectful is sitting back and listening. And
Mm,
there are many times when that is what's useful to do. And then there are times when that leaves all the emotional labor and learning to the people of color and women in the room, right?
right.
And so there is, and I want to name too, the work I do with white folks is saying, start with the premise, we're good white people who have racial bias,
Yes.
right? And I'm clear about that. It's not a shaming or blaming, but it is a naming how our racism shows up. And same thing with men. You're a good guy. You got given some crappy information about how to be a human on the planet,
Yeah.
and you get to heal from that. And unfortunately, you might have some feelings about that healing process, i.e. defensiveness, right? Discomfort, right?
Yeah.
Shame, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And so starting from the premise of like, you're a good guy, we're good white people, and we've been given some bad information and we've got to unlearn it and heal from it. Yeah.
Yeah. You and I now both offer one-on-one coaching in this realm, and in those realms, because the work really is individual. In those realms, what differences do how much deeper, how much farther can an individual take their journey when they take the time and they commit to 4, 8 sessions with an individual who can listen, guide those questions.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, and that you didn't name it specifically, but I think like you working with men is what's useful. Me working
Yes,
with women, or me working, us, we both work with white folks, but
yes,
you're on my list, and there's like 5 other white men. White men working with white men is is really
exactly.
is absolutely needed, and it's like more like the fast track. If we work on the group that's causing the most harm, then maybe that'll like reduce the harm, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think just similar to therapy, although I'm clear it's not therapy, I'm not a therapist, you're not a therapist. Um,
right.
People are able to, especially if they're in leadership, and bring this back to organizationally, or in a company, leadership and hierarchy are lonely. And that's part of the messed up setup to have to go at it alone. That's the individualism, that's the perfectionism and competition that's embedded in white supremacy culture, and then map that to economics and capitalism. So people are often, especially white leaders, are rumbling around with this stuff in their heads alone, and they feel like they can't talk to anybody. And even HR, there's a limitation of what they can say. And I think in one-on-one coaching, one great thing about that is people can truly say what's going on in their brains, right?
Mhm.
And what they are, walking around trying to figure out or struggling with or confused about. And I think there's, lots that's useful in a group coaching session. I've done lots of white women cohorts or groups, because then they learn that they're not alone. There's nothing
Yeah.
specifically wrong with them, that they can't figure this one thing out, or they keep making this mistake. And I use the word mistake to talk about when we're racist. Oops.
Yes.
Oh, I did that,
Yeah.
did that. There goes my urgency flaring up and trampling over my relationships with people of color, so I say mistake in the sense of like, whoops, I did that thing. And especially for folks that have a self-awareness, have a working knowledge around this stuff, it is like that practice of like, oh, I did that again. There it is. So in a group setting, I think it's useful as well, because then you learn, oh, other people do it too. And how do you think about it? And oh, that's interesting. Like you get perspective. And so much of, like you said, colonization is about individuating and separating, and we lack connection.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the group cohort method can really bring people together. And I can see that as being very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I the more we dig into this work, the more I realize that no matter what our racial identity is, no matter what our gender is, our gender identity is, the reality is that if we're going to change systems, any system, but in particular these systems, then the only way to change them is not through policy or procedure or voting. Those are technical fixes. The system remains the same. It's through self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-regulation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Individuals changing systems, and I mean, many strategies are needed. We need all the strategies moving, full steam ahead on all of it, right? And I think this piece of, so what does that look like? And sometimes, organizationally or in companies, there isn't a listening, or it won't be received to name sexism.
Yeah.
So I had one client where all they could do was talk about barriers. That was the
word.
Yeah. So some of this is like, all right, strategy, what can be received? Because if you come in swinging or clobbering, as I used to only be able to clobber, we need nuance, we need tactics and strategies, and sometimes, just even how things are communicated. Communication as a key strategy, like how are we going to communicate this? What words will be received? What will turn people off? What will trigger them? And being aware of, okay, we're kind of coddling here, but it's so that we can move forward over here, right? Like we make, at least it's in choice. It's in choice, and it's in service to this bigger vision, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I know it's interesting. You do talk about, you're talking about this evolution of self as you do this work, and tell me a little bit about your evolution in perspective around working with leaderships in boards, C-suite, or cabinet, as opposed to working with being brought in to do a workshop for the broader organization that may not even involve those leaders. What do you see as far as evolution and change within organizations, depending on which group you're working with?
So like I said, I think leadership's a tricky spot, and I'll just take the nonprofit model because that's my background, which is, does definitely have different dynamics than like a company or government. You have the board, and you have an executive director, and then maybe whoever, is directly below them, deputy director, chief of staff, whatever, program director, development director, whatever. And in that model, you have a bottleneck where the ED is the one lone person, whether it's a man or a woman, and something like 80% of nonprofits are run by white folks in the U.S.
Yeah.
GuideStar puts out that some of that information. So you have this bottleneck of where the ED is in between the board and the staff, and I think that it's an impossible setup in some ways with that situation. Like, we can look at the flawed racist history of nonprofits, and, the kind of the messed up policies that got us to having a nonprofit sector. And why are there so many white women in the nonprofit sector? What's up with that? And that's a lot of the work that I do. So starting there, like what's the architecture of this, and then seeing how, there's usually like, I work so hard to get here,
Yes.
that transcends sectors or industries. I work so hard to get here because capitalism has such a tight hold, right? It's like bearing down on us and getting worse and worse. Well, the few get the smaller than the 1% just gets exponentially richer, and everyone else is like barely making ends meet. So, so we're in the squeeze of capitalism, like this pressure, like what's that? where it's spinning from two ends, where you like press a piece of wood together. What's that called?
Yeah.
What's
A
that called?
vice.
A vice. Yeah, it's like
Yes.
a vice of capitalism. And then, yeah, I don't know how we could weave the white supremacy culture into that technical metaphor as well, right?
It'll
Um,
work.
yeah, it'll work. Yeah. And so I think, naming that people are, especially right now, it's like things are so hard and the world is such a dumpster fire. And with the onslaught of like facing all the oppression that we're witnessing worldwide all the time is weighing us down in terms of emotional capacity and energetic like ability to kind of like stay in it. So that's one thing I hear a lot, where usually leaders need to be honored first.
Mm.
Yes, they worked so hard to get here. And no, we know that if they're white, then they had a leg up. If they have, class privilege, if they have an Ivy League degree, we know like there's privilege often inside of all of that. And I think so. There's this setup of initial defensiveness. I'm working a group of one client now where it's an all white C-suite, and then generational differences. So we're kind of veering from like another thing here,
That's
but
okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many. They're all happening at the same time.
It's all happening. Yeah.
But generational differences are really, really big, and it's rampant or not rampant, but like everyone is experiencing this tension amongst different generational work norms. We have over 5 generations present in the U.S. capitalist workforce right now, more than we've ever had. So understand
That's incredible.
There's different norms and preferences and values. What's professional? Work ethic is a big one. Elders are like, you're not working hard enough. People are like, I don't want to work like you. You're falling apart. Like, this looks terrible. Right? Like,
Yeah.
hello, work-life balance. I'm not gonna work that hard, right?
Not to mention, when they were younger, it was the effort they had to put in to get ahead is less than what people their age today have to.
Right. And that's, so there's some context about this moment versus whatever 20, 50 years ago. And so I think all of that's added up. And you asked me originally about leaders. And so you often, not always, leaders are older. And, sometimes it's not necessarily about a number. If they've been at a company for a long time, tenure can really contribute to this as well. But it's all wrapped up in a piece of what happens in terms of, especially white leaders, not really making any moves on racial justice in a really true way, right?
Yes.
I'll pause there. That was a long monologue.
No, that was a great monologue. It is complicated. It is complex. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Dr. G and I continue to do podcasts, is because in some sort of free form way, I can't think of a better way in order to do this. I can write articles all day, right? I can do workshops, which are in a box, but here's a way in order to talk to a colleague, or somebody that we can explore these conversations. Bottom line, it's going to be complex.
Yeah.
So I think, I think with leaders, I love your idea that leaders need to be honored. I think that opens a door, right? Maybe just a little bit. And then once we're in, my notion is, and I have limited experience with this thus far, but so far it plays out. I think that the smaller group dynamics and/or one-on-one coaching is really where leaders are going to benefit the most, far more than the workshops.
Yeah. Well, and in the workshops, I just got off a client call where people talked about, when we do group all staff, it's actually hard for some folks to share when leadership is present.
Right. Yes. Well said. Really well said.
And I want to be clear, we're honoring folks so that we can then give them some critical hard feedback.
Yes.
Like to say, okay, and here's where you're causing harm.
Yeah.
And it has to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's up to you.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that there's a big difference between, because as leaders, they've in order to get where they're at, they've had to be in positions and situations where the leaders above them were providing feedback and coaching and moving them forward. So
Yeah.
they know how to work with
Mhm.
this information.
Mhm.
And
Yes, maybe because
okay.
previous, like, I don't know about you, but some, feedback is like a newer-ish thing. People, it was just sort of like you make it or you don't.
Yes.
Right? So there is a
Yeah.
little bit of like, because I think that's part of the generational tensions of like all of this one client where it's the all white C-suite. They're like, all these young people just keep complaining all the time. Like
Right.
right. And like, so there's this generational piece about you should just take it, or, and then like what's appropriate to give feedback and requesting transparency. Like you haven't
Mm,
earned the right to know this information, like all of that is in there.
it
And
is.
so I think we had to acquiesce to whatever our bosses and mentors wanted. And then so that's what we did, and all of that. Yeah, so I think there some folks maybe have had to experience it, but I think broadly speaking, there's some real discrepancies here.
I
Mhm.
would, yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's another dynamic there that is at play, and probably less so today, but certainly has played a big part, and that is for fraternalism.
Yeah.
So many leaders of our generation and the generations before are moved into these positions because of fraternalism, which is often white and patriarchal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So just, to bring it back to what we started with here, I feel like there's a couple calls to action for white folks, for white men and for white women, to like lift this up as a topic.
Yeah.
What's going on between, as a place to observe, what's going on between the white men and white women in our organization? What's the
Yes.
nature of the relationships? How is it playing out, with hierarchy and positionality? Um, and then, caucusing in that way, or meeting specifically is okay, how about the white men meet? How about the white women meet? And what's there to look at, both white supremacy culture characteristics and way patriarchy and sexism might be operating, including for women internalized sexism. Where are we perpetuating it? Where am I colluding with the oppression because it's what I had to do to make it to be in this position, right? Or
Right.
where am I like harming other women and thinking it's leadership, right? Taking on male leadership traits, or thinking
Totally.
what it means to be a leader or a boss. A lot of that is really harmful as well.
It is. And there is a fear of being vulnerable with people who work for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
We lead through a form of stoicism,
Mhm.
and that is not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
you said something to me a couple weeks ago that I thought was really impactful. You asked the question of uh, you were giving an example in a coaching scenario. How do people experience you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That has resonated with me ever since. Not just in my own self-reflection, but I found myself repeating that to clients and to friends
Yeah.
because what a wonderful invitation for self-reflection. How do
Yeah.
people experience you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And often the more privilege we have, the less aware we are of knowing how
Yes.
people experience us. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, the context we were talking about that is you working with another white man, and that was
Correct.
offering like this is a useful question to ask. Does he know how other people experience him? Usually the answer is no. I asked this once in a white caucus with someone who was pretty not into the work we were doing. And I said, do you know how people experience you? Or he's like, no, no, I don't. Like, and he was kind of righteous about it. I'm like, that might be a place to explore. He
That's so
wasn't
funny.
interested in that moment or
Yeah.
ever. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I shared it with a different client
Mhm.
for a very similar reason.
Yeah.
And they were a generation older than me, and
Mhm.
and I received the same response.
Yeah.
No, and why should I?
Right.
Right? I mean, I get to move around the world how I wish.
Yeah. Hmm.
That doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. 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 I
You
mean, like
know,
that's literally privilege embodied, right?
that's
That's,
privilege embodied.
yeah, the privilege to not know or think about the way other people experience you. and not have to adjust. I mean, that's all people on the receiving end of oppression. They're all, is as adjusting to, okay, what's happening with whoever the oppressor is, right? Like you're hyper aware of what they're doing and what's going on for survival.
Right.
Yeah.
And that adjustment comes in the form of the way they speak, the way they dress, the way they walk,
Yeah.
right. And it just depends,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap up our nice little conversation here. Fleur, where can people get a hold of you, reach you?
Yeah. I do have an in-person workshop coming up, which I haven't done one in a long time. It's so fun to do. It's April 19th for white women on our role in racial justice, or in embodying more racial justice. So all that info is on my website, or you can email me. So it's fleurlarsenfacilitation.com. You can find information there, or you can reach out, and I'm happy to share it with you. And a lot of that work I do is general, like DEI, racial justice, consulting, strategizing, facilitation, and I'll do a lot of white caucus work. That's every client I'm facilitating white caucus work. And then I run a cohort with Michelle Muri, one of the co-founders of community-centric fundraising, for white women in nonprofits on how to implement the CCF principles. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about who I am or the work I'm doing and how to reach me. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Well, and Fleur's website is going to be in the description of this particular podcast, so you can reach out and reach her there. This has been a fantastic little conversation of the Plowline Podcast. And if you are interested in the work for one-on-one coaching with men, then you can reach out to me through our website, which is co3consulting.net. It's CO, the number 3, consulting.net. And if you'd like to become a supporter of the Plowline Podcast and all the work that Jerry and I do, you can go to patreon.com/Plowline Productions. And what you'll find there now is you'll find Jerry's latest book, which she took the guiding principles of the evolution of aloha, and she converted them into a children's book while she's finishing up the explorative memoir that deals with the same thing for adults.
We
So
have
check it
that
out.
book. I read it to my 2-year-old almost every night. She loves the Book of Aloha, and she often goes, "I'm aloha and you're aloha."
Oh my gosh, I love that. We have had the richest feedback on that book. Like it's been beautiful.
Yeah,
So
really, really, really sweet.
you can get the book on Amazon. Bookshop.org is a great place to go. And you can find links on this website as well as Patreon, Co3, and the evolutionofaloha.com. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I look forward to talking with you all soon and later. Fleur, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.